The summer of 1716 was unlike any South Carolina had seen before. The air itself seemed alive, trembling with heat. Days stretched long and cruel. The sky shimmered above the rice fields, and the swamps steamed like open wounds. Mosquitoes swarmed thick as smoke, and the enslaved men and women working the paddies labored under a sun that never forgave. Far away from the fields, inside the great halls of Greyfield Estate, something darker was brewing, a gathering of the colony's most powerful men, men who believed the land, the crops, and the very souls of the people working on them belonged to them by divine right. 14 of them rode out to Greyfield that June, planters, traders, judges, and slave breeders. They came not as guests, but as masters of an empire built on chains. Their carriages creaked down the oak-lined drive, horses slick with sweat. Each man wore wealth on his sleeve, polished boots, silk waistcoats, and signet rings that flashed in the afternoon light. They came to discuss what they always discussed: money, labor, and control. But this meeting would never adjourn. 3 days later, when the sheriff's men broke into the house, they found 14 corpses burned black, arranged in a perfect circle around a great coal furnace that still glowed red at its heart. Their hands were bound with iron shackles, their mouths stuffed with raw cotton, and the stone floor beneath them was slick with melted wax and blood. And at the center of it all sat a woman, a slave named Espiranza de Lima, quietly sharpening a kitchen knife, her eyes fixed on nothing, humming a slow Portuguese lullaby that didn't fit the horror surrounding her. When the constables questioned her, she did not cry, beg, or explain. She simply said one sentence in broken English: "Justice burns slower than coal, but it burns complete." No one in the room moved. Within hours, Governor Robert Johnson himself ordered every document, every record, every account sealed and buried deep in the archives of Charleston. The official story would say it was an accident, a kitchen fire, an unfortunate tragedy. But people whispered. In taverns, in the markets, in the slave quarters, they whispered of a woman who had done what no army had ever dared, who turned the master's tools against them, who burned the heart out of their power in one night of fire and silence. The setting of a colony, built on chains. To understand what happened that night, you must understand the world that made it possible. In 1716, South Carolina was a colony soaked in heat, wealth, and cruelty. Charleston, the port city, was booming. Ships arrived almost daily from Africa and the Caribbean, their holds packed with enslaved men and women. The rice plantations along the coast made planters rich beyond measure. The economy thrived on suffering, and human lives were reduced to numbers in ledgers and prices in pounds sterling. It was here that Edmund Greyfield ruled. Greyfield was a man made for this cruel age, tall, pale and cold as the marble columns of his estate. His family had carved a 3,000-acre empire from the marshes north of the Ashley River. He owned more than 200 slaves and took pride in being called efficient. His reputation for breaking people was known across the colony. Slaves whispered that those sent to Greyfield either died or came back hollow, their spirits crushed beyond repair. He believed fear was a science and cruelty an art. His estate was both mansion and prison, where every inch of luxury was built on the bones of the people who served it. Among them was one woman who refused to break. The arrival of Espiranza de Lima, 15 years before the massacre, 1701, a Portuguese slave ship named Santa Maria dropped anchor in Charleston Harbor. It carried 180 captives taken from the coast of Angola. The voyage had already claimed dozens of lives. Men thrown overboard in chains, women dead from fever, children gone before they reached the New World. One of the survivors was a young woman with dark eyes that never looked away, and scars across her shoulders that told a story her captors couldn't read. Her name in her own tongue was lost to history, but the traders gave her a new one: Espiranza de Lima. They did not know she was the daughter of a chief. They did not know that she had been taught strategy, negotiation, and medicine, or that she carried in her mind the rituals and symbols of her people, the wisdom of herbs and poisons, and the unshakable calm of someone who had seen her world destroyed once before. When Edmund Greyfield bought her for 42 sterling, he thought he was buying another silent servant. He was wrong. From the moment she set foot on the Greyfield Estate, Espiranza watched. She learned the language quickly, though she pretended not to. She memorized faces, routines, the layout of the house, the creak of every door, and the pattern of the guards' patrols. She served wine and cleared dishes in silence, but she heard everything. Greyfield believed she was obedient. He had no idea that she was studying him, and every man who came through his door. The Rice Council, the Greyfield Estate, was more than a plantation. It was a headquarters. Every month, 14 of the wealthiest plantation owners gathered in Greyfield's dining hall. They called themselves the Rice Council, a name that sounded innocent, even noble. But in truth, it was a cartel. They controlled rice prices, land deals, and slave importation. Their decisions shaped the entire colony. These men were the real rulers of South Carolina. Around that table sat men who represented every corner of power. William Peton, the largest rice producer in the colonies. James Rutherford, a judge and landowner. Marcus Sutton, a trader whose fortune came from seasoning newly arrived slaves. Henry Caldwell, with ties to the governor's office. Benjamin Fairfax, heir to an English dynasty. Samuel Kingsley, breeder of human lives. Robert Fielding, expert in torture and discipline. Charles Warwick, who paid to watch floggings. Jonathan Crichton, who kept breeding ledgers like prize cattle. David Norris, a plantation doctor who kept slaves alive only to work longer. Alexander Hartwell, warden of a private slave prison. George Baxter, the youngest member, eager to prove his cruelty. They drank, they laughed, and they treated human suffering as business. And Espiranza stood behind them, silent, unseen, absorbing every word. For 15 years she memorized their secrets, their alliances, their weaknesses. She knew who cheated whom, who hated whom, who feared exposure and who was too proud to notice the servant standing in the corner. To them, she was nothing. But she was listening. 15 years of silence. Silence became her armor. She never spoke unless spoken to. She never reacted to their stories of whippings and burnings, though each word carved itself into her memory. She learned patience in a world that offered her none. While the masters debated profits, she counted the seconds between their laughs, the way their hands trembled when they lied, the small tells that marked their guilt. She learned how power looked up close, fragile, indulgent, blind, and slowly she began to plan. At first, her plan had no form. It was only an idea, a whisper that one day there would be balance. But as years passed, the idea hardened into purpose. She studied the estate's kitchen, the great coal furnace imported from England, capable of reaching temperatures hot enough to melt metal. She learned how to feed it, how to control it, how to make it burn hotter and longer than anyone thought possible. She practiced stillness until she became invisible. She practiced memory until it was sharper than any blade. By the time the Rice Council gathered for the meeting of June 23, 1716, Espiranza de Lima knew everything she needed to know to destroy them. And so began the story of the Greyfield Massacre, the night when one enslaved woman burned the masters of a colony and forced a world built on cruelty to look upon its own reflection. The Greyfield Estate stood like a monument to wealth and a grave to humanity. Built of pale stone brought from England and timber cut from the Carolina swamps, it rose from the earth like something that shouldn't have survived there. Around it stretched a sea of rice paddies, glistening under the sun like mirrors of gold. But those fields were watered with blood, sweat, and tears. Every path that led to the mansion told the same story. Bare footprints sunk into the mud beside wagon tracks. Overseers on horseback patrolled the dikes, their whips hanging like serpents. The air was thick with humidity and the sour smell of decay. Inside the main house, everything was spotless. White walls, chandeliers, imported carpets, a piano shipped from London. The illusion of civilization standing on a foundation of brutality. The masters called it progress. The slaves called it hell. For Edmund Greyfield, cruelty wasn't just a necessity, it was a performance. He believed control was achieved through fear, not fairness. He had perfected his methods until pain itself became routine. He made punishments public, whippings done in front of others, executions drawn out for days. He called it discipline. They called it Greyfield justice. The science of breaking people. Every plantation had its system, but Greyfield's was infamous. He believed slaves were not born submissive. They had to be broken. His overseers carried notebooks filled with observations. How long a person could work without rest. How many lashes it took before they begged. How starvation affected obedience. To Greyfield, suffering was data. He had a private storage room in the main house where he kept instruments of punishment, chains of different weights, iron collars, spiked cuffs, and brands for marking human skin. The shelves were organized like a workshop. Everything had a place. Everything had a purpose. He treated rebellion as a disease and believed pain was the cure. When slaves resisted or even looked at him the wrong way, he would make examples of them, locking them in the heat shed, a tin-roofed box that baked under the sun until the victim passed out. He didn't kill for pleasure. He killed to demonstrate ownership, and yet through all of it, Espiranza survived. The invisible woman, she became the shadow of the house, the quiet, watchful presence who moved unnoticed. In a world where every eye was trained on her, she learned the art of being unseen. She listened more than she spoke, observed more than she acted. Every cruel order, every whispered plan, every careless conversation between masters and overseers found its way into her memory. By day, she served Greyfield's household, preparing meals, cleaning rooms, fetching wine. By night, she memorized. She memorized where Greyfield kept his keys, where the gunpowder was stored, which doors creaked, which servants talked too much, which slaves were loyal and which were too afraid to act. She learned how to read lips, to interpret body language, to anticipate mood changes before they happened. When Greyfield raised his voice, she could tell by the way his jaw tightened what kind of rage was coming. And she learned patience, the weapon no master could ever take from her. The monthly gatherings once a month. The Greyfield Estate transformed. The Rice Council came riding in from their plantations, coaches rumbling down the long drive, servants rushing to polish silver and prepare rooms. For Espiranza, these meetings were her window into the empire of slavery. She heard everything. The men would eat roasted pork, imported wine, and bread baked from flour shipped across the Atlantic. Between bites, they would trade tips on how to manage their property. Whipping's fine, one would say, but too much leaves scars that hurt market value. Keep them half-fed, another would add. Too hungry and they revolt. Too full and they get lazy. The laughter that followed was the sound of moral rot. They discussed marriages between slaves as if they were breeding livestock. They compared yields of children, and the market prices those children would fetch when old enough to work. They joked about deaths in the fields like men trading hunting stories. Every word went into Espiranza's memory. Every cruel laugh added another layer to her silence. The furnace among all the rooms in the Greyfield Estate. None fascinated Espiranza more than the kitchen, and its centerpiece, the coal furnace. It was enormous. 8 feet tall, 4 feet wide, built of imported fire brick and reinforced with iron. Greyfield had ordered it from London as a symbol of his success. It could maintain temperatures over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, far hotter than any wood-burning hearth. He used to brag about it to his guests. This furnace, he'd say, represents progress. You feed it once and it works the whole day. But Espiranza saw something else. She saw power, control, patience. She learned how it worked. The way air vents regulated heat, how coal types changed temperature, how to stoke it to reach peak burn and hold it there for hours. She used this knowledge daily, tending fires for endless meals, baking bread for the council's feasts. No one noticed how often she checked its temperature, how carefully she measured coal, how she watched the way flames danced behind the iron grate. To her, it wasn't just a furnace. It was a promise, the death of Sarah before Espiranza. Another woman had served as Greyfield's house slave, an older woman named Sarah. She had endured years of Greyfield's cruelty. And though her body obeyed, her eyes never did. One night, Sarah accidentally spilled red wine on the imported English carpet in the dining room. The next morning, she was found dead behind the stables. The overseers said she fell. The slaves knew better. Greyfield had beaten her to death himself. Espiranza cleaned the blood from the carpet that day, her face expressionless, her mind already learning. That was the day she stopped hoping for mercy and began planning for justice. Seeds of vengeance, as years passed. Greyfield's wealth grew. He acquired more land, more slaves, more power. His cruelty deepened, his arrogance sharpened, and each month the Rice Council gathered under his roof, laughing, drinking, and plotting ways to profit further from human misery. And through it all, Espiranza listened. She heard about ships arriving from Africa. She heard about slave markets expanding westward. She learned which planters cheated their partners, which wives hid affairs, which overseers were cruel even by Greyfield standards. Knowledge became her shield. Every secret she kept was a weapon waiting to be used. She waited 15 years, and when her moment finally came, she would not hesitate. The calm before the storm, in the final years before the massacre, something about Espiranza changed. Other slaves noticed it. She walked differently, quieter, slower, but with a strange calm in her eyes. She started asking questions, not dangerous ones, but curious ones. She learned how coal was stored, who carried the keys to the pantry, how much rum the council drank during meetings. No one paid attention. Why would they? To them, she was invisible, a shadow in the house, but shadows remember. And in silence, they learned to burn. The storm was coming. The fire was waiting. And the walls of Greyfield would soon learn that even the quietest woman can make history scream. By the year 1715, 15 years had passed since Espiranza first set foot on the Greyfield Estate. The world outside the plantation had changed. Charleston's harbor was busier than ever, the Rice Council richer than before, and the slave ships came so often now that locals stopped noticing their sails on the horizon. But inside the plantation nothing changed. Pain remained the language of labor, and silence was still the only form of survival. Espiranza had become a part of the house itself, quiet, efficient, invisible. She knew every floorboard that creaked, every door that jammed, every habit of every man who entered those halls. Her memory was her map and her patience her weapon. And yet beneath all that control, a human pulse still beat inside her, steady, restrained, but alive. It was that faint pulse that led her to Quame, the boy they called Tom. He arrived at Greyfield under another name, Boy Tom. Plantation ledgers recorded him as property of the Rutherford estate, on loan to Greyfield for a construction project, building new storage sheds along the Rice Canal. He was 22 years old, tall and strong, his skin darkened by years in the Carolina sun. But it wasn't his strength that drew attention. It was his eyes. Unlike most, his gaze didn't drop when overseers shouted. He looked at people the way a man looks at puzzles, assessing, measuring, remembering. He was dangerous, though he didn't yet know it. He could read, a secret he kept buried like gold. A sympathetic overseer, now long dead, had taught him letters using fragments of discarded newspapers and Bible pages. To know how to read was to possess forbidden fire. When Espiranza saw him for the first time, it was from the kitchen doorway. He was hauling heavy timber under the noonday sun, his shirt torn, sweat running down his back, but his posture straight. Something about him didn't fit this place. He worked hard, but without the broken rhythm of the others. He moved like a man who still believed he was human. The first words, it took months before they spoke. The first time was an accident, or perhaps fate disguised as routine. Quame had been ordered to deliver sacks of rice to the main house. Espiranza was in the kitchen, kneading bread dough. When he entered, she didn't look up. He placed the sacks down, dusted his hands, and whispered almost to himself. "Too heavy for one man," she replied quietly without turning. "You learn to carry what you cannot refuse." For a few seconds, the kitchen went still. Then she looked up. Their eyes met, and in that single moment, both recognized the same thing, the spark of someone not yet broken. That night, Kwame hummed a strange tune while walking back to the slave quarters, a rhythm Espiranza recognized. It was a melody her people used back in Angola, carried through generations. Distorted but still alive. The next morning, she answered that melody with a different verse. They had found a language no master could hear. The secret songs, the two began to communicate through work songs, like hundreds of slaves did across the plantations. But their words carried hidden meanings. A longer note meant danger. A lower pitch meant wait. A certain rhythm told the other which overseer was nearby. At first, it was survival. Then it became trust. Then it became something else. They met in secret near the edge of the rice fields, by a fallen cypress tree half swallowed by mud and moss. There, under the chorus of frogs and nightbirds, they spoke freely, in Portuguese, in fragments of African tongues, and in the English they had learned to mimic. Kwame listened more than he spoke. Espiranza tested him with questions. What would you do if you could leave? Where would you go if you were free? He always answered the same way. Freedom without the rest of our people is not freedom. It's escape. For the first time in 15 years, Espiranza felt her silence crack, not in fear, but in hope. The network. What began as love became strategy. Kwame's work took him to other plantations owned by members of the Rice Council. He hauled lumber, dug canals, repaired fences, and listened. He memorized patrol routes, overseer rotations, food rations, and guard schedules. At night, he shared what he learned with Espiranza beneath the cypress tree. She in turn gave him information overheard at Greyfield, the council's plans, new slave laws from London, trade rumors, and political gossip. Together, they began to map the hidden world of South Carolina's plantations. They knew where sympathetic whites lived, indentured servants who hated their masters. They knew which slaves had access to weapons, which could navigate the swamps, which knew the stars well enough to guide fugitives at night. Their meetings grew riskier. Once an overseer nearly caught them. They escaped only because Espiranza had deliberately changed her work schedule that week, keeping the kitchen lights burning past midnight to cover her absence. Bit by bit, they were building an invisible web, a network of information strong enough to one day break the chain that bound them. The vision in late 1715, they began to dream aloud. Not of running away. Espiranza had seen too many die in the swamps for that. Their dream was larger, more dangerous. We can do more than flee, she told him one night. We can make them remember us. Kwame stared at her through the darkness. You mean fight? I mean think, she said. They believe we cannot think. That is their weakness. She spoke of coordinated uprisings, plantations burning in the same night, supply lines cut, weapons stolen, and survivors escaping south toward Spanish Florida, where slavery was outlawed. Kwame was cautious but inspired. He began spreading whispers disguised as hymns, testing loyalty among the field hands. By the spring of 1716, they had contacts across nearly 10 plantations. It was the beginning of something vast, the breeding announcement, and then everything changed. During the Rice Council's meeting of March 15, 1716, Espiranza served as usual, pouring wine, clearing plates, head bowed low. The men spoke of profits, land disputes, and new slave imports. Then Greyfield stood and announced his latest idea. To strengthen our labor force, he said, we will begin a controlled breeding program. Select females will be paired with prime males from other estates to produce stronger offspring. The process will be supervised. The females will be housed separately until they conceive. The men applauded the brilliance of the plan. Laughter filled the room. Espiranza did not move. Her hands didn't tremble, her face didn't change. But something behind her eyes froze solid. Her name was first on Greyfield's list. That night she met Kwame at their usual place. The moon was high, the air heavy with the smell of rice water and decay. She told him what she had heard. He tried to stay calm, but his voice broke when he spoke. We run tonight, he said. I have a contact, a Spanish trader near the coast. We can reach Florida within a week. We can live. But she only looked at him, her voice steady as stone. Running saves us, she said. But it saves no one else, he argued, begged, reasoned. But she had already crossed the invisible line between survival and destiny, the choice. They sat in silence for a long time beneath the cypress tree. The night was loud with crickets, the moonlight broken across the water like shattered glass. Finally, Kwame took her hands. If you stay, he whispered, you'll die. If I leave, she replied, everything we've learned dies with me. He understood then that her will was stronger than fear. He promised to help her, even if it meant his own death. For the next 2 weeks, they worked faster, gathering everything they needed. Espiranza used her access to prepare the estate, collecting herbs for poison, learning which servants could be trusted, studying every detail of the kitchen's layout. Kwame, meanwhile, secured information about the other council members who would attend the next meeting. The plan that formed between them was not the plan of desperate slaves, it was the plan of strategists. The last meeting beneath the tree 3 nights before the fateful day. They met one final time under the cypress. The fireflies flickered around them like silent witnesses. Espiranza looked at him and said, "Tomorrow they decide my body's purpose, but I've already decided their fate." He tried to smile, but his voice cracked. "Then let me come with you." She shook her head. "No, someone must survive to tell them what happened. Someone must remember why." He wanted to argue, but he knew better. Her mind was made of iron. They held each other until dawn, their last embrace before history took its breath. The spark, before the fire, in the following days, Espiranza's demeanor remained unchanged. She worked, cleaned, cooked. No one noticed that she was carefully preparing for war. She began storing coal near the furnace, claiming it was for a larger meal. She polished the iron rods used for cooking. She placed extra shackles in the kitchen, saying Greyfield wanted them nearby for discipline. No one questioned her. Why would they? She was invisible again, calm, quiet, obedient. But inside her, a storm was forming. And by the time the Rice Council gathered again at Greyfield Estate in June of 1716, every ember of that storm was ready to ignite. The night of the massacre was coming. The masters would soon learn what happens when silence chooses to speak in fire. The date was June 23rd, 1716. The sky above Charleston hung heavy with clouds that refused to break. The air was thick, unmoving, the kind of heat that made even shadows sweat. On nights like this, the colony seemed to hold its breath. Inside the Greyfield Estate, preparations were underway. Servants scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed. Silverware was polished to a blinding shine, and barrels of brandy were rolled into the pantry. The masters were coming. For the slaves, it meant a night without rest. For Espiranza de Lima, it meant the end of 15 years of waiting. The morning before at dawn, she woke before anyone else. She dressed in the same plain cotton gown she always wore. Her face gave nothing away, but her movements were precise, measured. Every step already part of a plan only she understood. She began by tending the coal furnace. Normally, it would be lit only in the afternoon for dinner preparations. That day she started it before sunrise. The first crack of flint sent a spark into the darkness, and soon the furnace began to breathe, its iron throat glowing faint red. Hour by hour, she fed it carefully, chestnut coal for endurance, bituminous for heat. By noon the fire was strong enough to cook a man alive. She adjusted the dampers, watched the draft, memorized the rhythm of the flame. No one questioned her. She had earned the trust of every overseer in that house. They thought she was devoted, efficient, one of those rare slaves who had accepted her place. They were wrong. The arrival of the masters, by 2 in the afternoon, the first carriages arrived. The men of the Rice Council stepped out in their silks and waistcoats, fanning themselves with imported linen handkerchiefs. They complained about the heat, about taxes, about the increasing insolence of their slaves. Edmund Greyfield greeted them on the steps, smiling with pride. To him, this gathering was more than business, it was theater. His mansion was the stage, his guests the audience, and he, the performer of wealth and dominance. Inside, the long dining table was set with roasted pheasant, fresh bread, spiced rice, and sugared fruit. The smell filled every room, masking the faint scent of burning coal drifting from the kitchen. Espiranza moved like a shadow among them, pouring wine, refilling plates, nodding silently at every command. Not one of them noticed how still her eyes were. Conversations of cruelty. The men ate and drank greedily. Between mouthfuls they spoke of profits, new ships, and their latest disciplinary methods. Marcus Sutton bragged about a new device, a rotating cage meant to punish disobedience without killing. William Peaton boasted that his slaves worked 16 hours a day on less food. Rutherford laughed that he'd sold a child away from its mother, just to teach her humility. The table erupted with laughter. To them, these weren't atrocities, they were innovations. Espiranza heard every word. Her hands never shook as she poured another round of brandy. But inside her chest, something steady and ancient began to rise. like a tide that had waited too long. The poison at dusk, when the meal ended, Espiranza cleared the table and began serving brandy. It was custom. The council never ended without Greyfield's finest liquor. But that night, the brandy carried something else. Days earlier, she had mixed a powder from herbs known only to her, roots from the swamp, dried berries, and sap from the manchineel tree. Not enough to kill, just enough to weaken, to make limbs heavy and minds blur. By 9 o'clock, the men's laughter had turned sluggish, their words slurred. A few complained of dizziness, blaming the heat. Greyfield ordered the windows opened. Espiranza obeyed, letting the thick air seep in. The fire in the furnace glowed brighter through the open kitchen door. The silence after laughter at 9:47 p.m. The first man collapsed. Within minutes, the others followed, slumping in their chairs, spilling brandy across their waistcoats. The heavy thud of bodies hitting the floor echoed through the house. Espiranza moved quickly. She dragged each unconscious man to the kitchen one by one. Years of servitude had hardened her muscles. Fury gave her strength. She worked methodically, with the precision of someone performing a sacred ritual. She shackled their hands and feet using the same iron they had used on others. She stuffed raw cotton into their mouths so their screams wouldn't carry. She laid them in a perfect circle around the furnace, 14 bodies forming a ring of power around the very heart of their wealth. By midnight, her work was done. The furnace roared like a living thing. The air shimmered with heat. Sweat poured down her face, but she did not stop. She sat at the center of the room, sharpening her knife on a whetstone, waiting. The awakening. The first groan came around dawn. Then another. The men stirred, eyes fluttering open, confusion spreading into terror. The heat was unbearable. Their skin glistened, their throats parched, their hands bound. Edmund Greyfield was the first to understand. He tried to speak, but the cotton gag turned his words into muffled sobs. Espiranza stood. Slowly, calmly, she looked at each man. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said. Her voice was steady, almost kind. "You've spent years calling us property. Today I return the lesson." She walked to the table where Greyfield's ledger book lay open. It was the same book she had carried from his office the night before. The book that recorded every transaction, every life bought and sold. She began to read aloud. April 12th, 1713. Sold child, female, age 6. Mother unfit. Whipped before sale. Value 70, she turned the page. May 4th, 1715, man named Joseph. Attempted escape, ears removed. Died after punishment. No loss to profit, her voice never trembled. The men screamed behind their gags, shaking their heads, eyes wide with horror. "You wrote these words," she said softly. "Now you will hear them. The fire's lesson." She picked up an iron rod from beside the furnace. Its tip glowed white. "This," she said, "is the only language you ever taught me." One by one, she pressed the burning iron to their skin. The room filled with the sound of flesh searing and chains rattling. She didn't strike blindly. She branded them in the same places they had branded others. Shoulders, backs, faces. She didn't hurry. She wanted them awake. Every few minutes, she poured water into their mouths to keep them conscious. When one fainted, she splashed hot water on his face until he screamed again. By afternoon, the heat was unbearable. The men's silk coats were gone, burned away. Their hair clung to their foreheads in damp clumps. Their eyes were wild with pain. Still, she spoke to them, calm, deliberate, merciless. "You think yourselves gods," she said, "but gods do not bleed." Greyfield's turn as the sun began to set. Only 2 of them were left breathing, Edmund Greyfield and James Rutherford. Rutherford died first, choking on his own blood. Greyfield watched, trembling, tears cutting paths through the soot on his face. He tried to speak, to bargain, to beg. Espiranza pulled the cotton from his mouth. "I can give you freedom," he gasped. "I'll sign your papers. You can go anywhere." Espiranza looked at him for a long moment. "You cannot give what you never understood," she said. "You had freedom all your life and never knew its worth." Then she dragged his body closer to the furnace. The heat touched him like an unseen hand, blistering his skin. His screams filled the house until the air swallowed them whole. When it was over, she sat again at the table, sharpening her knife, humming her lullaby. The discovery 2 days later. When the plantation overseers finally dared to enter the main house, they found the scene untouched. 14 bodies in a circle, the furnace still warm. Espiranza seated at the table, calm, silent, her face blank as ash. When the constables questioned her, she didn't resist. She didn't defend herself. She simply said, "Justice burns slower than coal, but it burns complete." They could not comprehend what they were looking at. A woman who had destroyed the masters of a colony, not for freedom, but for truth. The cover-up Governor Robert Johnson was summoned that night. He read the reports, stared at the bodies, and knew instantly what had to be done. If the story spread, it would ignite rebellion across every plantation in the South. So, he buried it. The official record declared it a tragic kitchen fire. The bodies were said to have been burned accidentally while drunk. No trial, no funeral, no witnesses. Espiranza de Lima was sold quietly to a Spanish trader bound for Cartagena. The records claimed she died of fever at sea, but rumors began before the ship even left Charleston Harbor. Some said she escaped with the help of sympathetic sailors. Others said she was seen months later in Havana, speaking to freed slaves about the fire that remembers. No one knows what became of her. But the legacy she left behind was unstoppable. The whisper that would not die. Within months, plantations across South Carolina began to burn. Barns collapsed in flames. Overseers vanished. Poison found its way into wine. The Rice Council was gone, but its terror still ruled. And now that terror had learned to fear. They said her ghost walked the marshes at night, humming a song no one could place. They said if you listened close, you could still hear the words she spoke before the fire. Justice burns slower than coal, but it burns complete. The Greyfield Estate stood silent for days. No smoke rose from its chimneys. No sound of hammers or voices carried from the fields. Even the river beside the rice paddies seemed slower, thickened by something unseen. When the authorities finally arrived, they found what no one could have imagined. 14 of the richest men in South Carolina, bound, charred, unrecognizable, arranged in a perfect circle around a furnace that still breathed heat. The walls of the kitchen were black with soot, and the air smelled of iron and ash. At the center sat Espiranza de Lima, calm, silent, her face streaked with sweat and coal dust, sharpening a knife with slow, rhythmic strokes. She did not look at them when they entered. She only whispered one line as if to herself, "Justice burns slower than coal." But it burns complete. The panic of the master's news traveled faster than the governor's horses could ride. By sunset, whispers of the massacre had reached every plantation in the province. Servants carried the story in fragments. Some said it was witchcraft. Others claimed the slaves had risen in hundreds and slaughtered their masters. None of it was true, and yet every version frightened the masters more than truth ever could. Plantation owners armed themselves. Overseers doubled patrols. Guns were loaded and left by bedside tables. The powerful families who had ruled through cruelty now found themselves haunted by their own fear. No one spoke of it openly. To admit the truth was to admit that the unthinkable had happened, that a slave, a woman, had outwitted and destroyed the men who believed themselves gods. Governor Robert Johnson's dilemma. 3 days after the discovery, Governor Robert Johnson convened an emergency meeting at the Charleston Council Hall. The room was filled with trembling planters, military officers, and colonial advisors. On the long mahogany table lay a copy of the incident report. Johnson read it twice and said quietly, "If this truth spreads, we will lose the colony." The men debated for hours. Some demanded public execution. Others feared even that would give her legend power. One planter said, "Hang her and she becomes a martyr. Silence her and the fire dies." In the end, they chose secrecy. The massacre was officially recorded as a kitchen fire accident. The charred corpses were buried in unmarked graves behind the estate. The records were sealed in the Charleston archives with orders that they remain locked for 50 years. As for Espiranza, she was declared property again, sold quietly to a Spanish trader whose ship, Santa Isabella, was bound for Cartagena. Her chains were heavy. Her eyes were not. The ship that carried secrets on the evening of July 15, 1716. Santa Isabella set sail. Rain fell in thin sheets and the sea was restless, as if it knew what it carried. In the ship's hold, 43 slaves sat chained together. Among them, silent and calm, was Espiranza. The ship's first mate later wrote in his log that she did not speak, did not eat, did not even blink when others wept. He said she only hummed softly, endlessly, the same lullaby the overseers had heard in the kitchen. 3 days later, according to the captain's report, she died of fever and was buried at sea. But sailors talk, and sailors lie. Months later, a Spanish clerk in Havana claimed a Portuguese-speaking woman matching her description was transferred secretly to another vessel during a resupply stop. That ship was never recorded in the official manifest. Whether she survived or not, no one ever proved. But the rumors refused to die. The fear that spread like fire by autumn, plantations across the low country began to burn. First one barn, then another, then a master's house. No one could explain how fires started in locked kitchens, or why horses were poisoned, or why overseers disappeared on moonless nights. But every time a new tragedy struck, someone would whisper her name, Espiranza. Slaves began humming unfamiliar tunes while working, slow, rhythmic songs with words that didn't belong to English or Portuguese. Overseers said they heard lines like "Fire remember" and "Coal speak," though none could prove it. In taverns, white men drank in silence, speaking only in mutters about the demon of Greyfield. For the first time, the masters were afraid to be alone. The unrecorded rebellions, between 1717 and 1720, at least 13 smaller uprisings were recorded in South Carolina's colonial dispatches, though most were dismissed as accidents. In Beaufort, an overseer's family was found dead after drinking from a poisoned well. Savannah Neck, 5 slaves vanished after burning a storehouse to the ground. Near Ashley River, a field hand was caught with a detailed sketch of his master's property, drawn with military precision. None of these incidents were connected officially to Espiranza, but among the enslaved, the message was clear. She lit the first fire. We must carry the rest. The birth of a ghost in the years that followed. Stories about Espiranza de Lima changed shape like smoke. Some said she had escaped to Spanish, Florida, and joined a community of free blacks near St. Augustine. Others claimed she was captured again but cursed her captors before dying, causing their ship to sink in a storm. And then there were those who swore they saw her, a woman in white walking through rice fields under moonlight, humming softly. Wherever she passed, the next day would bring fire. The masters called her a ghost. The slaves called her memory. The law of fear by 1718. The colonial assembly passed new laws. Slaves could not gather in groups larger than 3. Curfews were enforced at sunset. Any slave found with a blade longer than a hand was whipped or hanged. But fear doesn't need weapons. It only needs patience. The more the masters tried to suppress her memory, the stronger it grew. Each whispered story became a spark. Each secret song became a hymn. Even in silence, her legend lived. Because the one thing no master could ever chain was imagination. The whisper across oceans in 1721. A Spanish ship's clerk in Cartagena recorded a strange encounter in his private diary. He claimed that while inventorying new slaves from Havana, he met a woman who spoke fluent Portuguese and English, and who seemed to know things she shouldn't. Names of plantations, maps of the Carolina coast, and details of the men who had burned in a circle. She told him, "The first lesson is done. The others are learning." The clerk never saw her again. But months later, Spanish officials in Florida reported the arrival of dozens of escaped slaves who possessed detailed knowledge of British patrol routes, knowledge they shouldn't have had. The whisper had crossed the sea. The lesson of the fire by the late 1720s, a saying spread among slaves across the colonies. The fire remembers. It meant that cruelty was never forgotten, that the oppressed might appear quiet, but beneath that quiet, coal burned slow and patient. Parents told the story of Espiranza to their children, not as a tale of horror, but as proof that one person, armed only with courage and intelligence, could shake an empire built on chains. She became more than a woman. She became a warning. Governor Johnson's legacy. Governor Johnson retired years later, his hair white, his hands trembling. He never spoke of the Greyfield incident again, But those close to him said that every summer, when the air grew hot and the coal stoves roared, he would close his windows and sit in silence. Sometimes, servants heard him whisper, "She's still burning." He died in 1735, but the records he sealed remained locked in Charleston's archives for 50 years, exactly as he ordered. When they were finally opened, in 1766 the world had already changed. The colonies were rumbling toward revolution, and somewhere in the backrooms of Charleston, scholars read the Greyfield Report for the first time in half a century. The details were enough to chill the blood. The circle of bodies, the coal furnace, the line she spoke. Some said that moment changed how even historians saw the birth of rebellion in America, not as something started by politicians, but by a slave woman who burned her masters into memory. The immortal fire long, after her name faded from records, her spirit lived in whispers. When the Stono Rebellion erupted in 39, the largest slave uprising in colonial America, some of its leaders were said to have come from plantations once tied to the Rice Council. When asked what inspired them, one man reportedly said, "The woman who burned the masters. She taught us that they bleed like men." No one knew if he spoke from truth or myth, but by then it no longer mattered. The myth was stronger than the record. The final echo decades later, the Greyfield kitchen was left in ruins. No one worked there. Every owner who tried to rebuild eventually sold the land, claiming strange sounds came from the empty air, chains rattling, coal crackling though the furnace had been cold for years. By the time the revolution began, the estate was gone, swallowed by the Carolina swamps. But when storms passed through the marshes, some travelers swore they could still see a faint orange light glowing in the distance. And if you listened closely, through the hiss of the wind, you could hear a woman's voice humming a lullaby in Portuguese. No one ever found her body, but everyone knew her name, Espiranza de Lima, the slave who turned fire into justice, the woman who proved that even silence can burn. Justice burns slower than coal, but it burns complete. The Greyfield Estate never truly recovered. Its fields went fallow, its walls cracked, and its name became something people spoke only in whispers. For decades after that night, children were warned not to go near the old property after dark. They said the ground still smelled of smoke. They said the wind carried screams. But it wasn't ghosts that haunted South Carolina. It was memory, the fear that ate the masters. The men who replaced the Rice Council knew nothing of courage. They built taller fences, hired more guards, and carried pistols to their own dining tables. But no weapon could silence the echo of what had happened at Greyfield. Every creak of a door, every flicker of light from a kitchen fire, every shadow of a servant moving in silence, it all felt like warning. They began to see revolt in every glance. They began to hear rebellion in every hymn. And so the South changed, not because laws were rewritten, but because fear rewrote behavior. Masters became prisoners of their own estates, trapped by paranoia. And the slaves, though still in chains, carried something the masters could never kill: hope, the network of whispers. No one could trace when the songs began to change. What once were hymns of sorrow became maps sung aloud. A verse about rivers pointed to escape routes. A line about stars told when it was safe to travel. A low hum under a work chant meant, "Fire soon." Each plantation believed the change was local. None realized that the rhythm had spread across the entire Carolina coast, a living network born from Espiranza's silence. They called it the Whisper Line. No ink. No paper, no evidence, only memory and melody. The masters had always believed knowledge was their weapon. Now, knowledge had turned against them. The rise of the hidden teachers. Years after Espiranza's disappearance, strange stories began to surface. In Spanish Florida, among communities of freed Africans and escaped slaves, there was talk of a woman who taught war without weapons. They called her La Mujer del Fuego, the woman of fire. Some said she was Portuguese, others said African royalty. Some swore her eyes burned like coal. She taught slaves how to read their masters' routines, how to count patrol steps, how to find the weakness in every stronghold. She said never fight strength with strength, burn their peace instead. Was she really Espiranza? No one knew, but the lessons matched her mind: patience, precision, punishment. Even the Spanish officers, though they laughed at first, later banned their soldiers from mentioning her name. Too many patrol camps burned in the night after she was spoken of. Charleston trembles by 1725. Charleston, once a proud port of trade, had become a city of watchtowers. Every street corner held guards. Every tavern door carried a notice promising rewards for escaped slaves. And yet ships kept losing cargo before they even left the docks. Merchants whispered that the slaves were organized. Impossible, they said. And yet tools went missing, barrels vanished. Powder exploded at night. The authorities blamed pirates, but those who lived closest to the fields knew better. This wasn't piracy. This was retribution. The fire that had burned in Greyfield's furnace had moved into the veins of the colony. The Masters' Council in the winter of 1727, a secret meeting took place in Charleston. 6 of the wealthiest plantation owners gathered behind locked doors to discuss what they called the shadow crisis. None dared to speak Espiranza's name, but all spoke of her consequence. She made them think, said one. They're learning too much. They already know enough, replied another. They know we can bleed. The plan that followed was simple and brutal. Crush the whispers through terror. Hundreds of slaves were executed without trial. Others were branded, mutilated, or chained in iron collars. But instead of silence, it brought song. The more they punished, the louder the work chants became. And hidden in those songs were messages, coordinates, and courage. The masters never understood that they weren't killing fear. They were feeding it, and fear, once born, always eats its master. Echoes in the swamp by 1730. The Carolina swamps had become sanctuaries. Runaways built hidden villages deep in the marshes, places of freedom that the whites never found. They called them fire settlements, and every one of them had a small circle of stones where no one dared to step. In the center of those circles, they said a fire would be lit every year on June 23rd, the night Espiranza took her revenge. It was never big, never loud, just enough flame to whisper through the dark. A flame that said, "We remember." No priest, no soldier, no master could erase that ritual. It was not rebellion, it was remembrance. The Stono Rebellion in 1739. The silence finally broke. Dozens of enslaved men and women rose near the Stono River, armed with stolen muskets and a courage generations in the making. They marched under a crude banner, shouting one word again and again: freedom. Historians would call it the Stono Rebellion, the largest slave uprising in colonial America. But among the enslaved, they called it something else: the Second Fire. When captured rebels were asked what inspired them, one man reportedly said, "The woman who burned the masters. She told us the fire never dies." Whether it was true or not didn't matter. The story had done its work. The shifting power after Stono. The colonial government responded with fear disguised as law. They passed new codes forbidding slaves from learning to read or gather without white supervision. They outlawed drums, banned African languages, and restricted movement. But for every rule written, more songs were born. The whites didn't understand that Espiranza had taught a language that couldn't be banned, the language of memory. It lived in rhythm, in pattern, in patience. The colonies were changing. The fire was no longer just in one kitchen. It was in every whispered prayer, every footstep that dared to march. The death of a myth by the 1750s. Many historians believed Espiranza had been a myth all along, a ghost story slaves told to comfort themselves. The archives remained sealed, and the masters called her tale superstition. But in the slave quarters, the story grew clearer with each telling. The names of the 14 men, the furnace, the circle, the lullaby, they remembered it all, detail by detail, generation by generation. The legend became instruction, a way to remember not only how she fought, but why, the legacy of fear and fire. When the archives finally opened in 1766, the truth came spilling out like embers from a long-closed grate. The report was read aloud by trembling hands. The room fell silent. There it was, every name, every wound, every word she had spoken. It wasn't myth, it was history. But by then, it didn't matter whether she had lived or died. Her work was already complete. The masters had learned to fear their own cruelty. The slaves had learned to believe in their own power. And in that shift, quiet, invisible, unstoppable. The foundations of an empire began to crack. The flame, eternal centuries later, long after the rice fields were gone and the estates had turned to dust, people still spoke of her, not as a spirit, not as a murderer, but as something larger, the first spark of justice in a land built on chains, the whisper that refused to die, the fire that burned slow, but burned complete. Espiranza de Lima, the name that turned fear into history, and history into fire. By the middle of the 18th century, the world that Espiranza de Lima had known was beginning to fracture. The British colonies stretched wider than ever before, their cities richer, their ships faster, their taxes heavier. Charleston's port gleamed with ivory, cotton, and rice, its wealth built on the same system of flesh and fear that Espiranza had once set ablaze. To the masters, slavery was now an institution, immovable, indispensable, and ordained by God himself. But beneath that glittering surface, in the fields and kitchens and quarters of the South, something restless smoldered. It wasn't rebellion yet. It was memory, passed down in lullabies, whispered in secret, kept alive by mothers who refused to forget. The Children of Fire, by 1740, an entire generation had grown up in the shadow of the Greyfield story. They had never seen Espiranza, never heard her voice, but they knew her name before they knew the name of their own masters. At night, children gathered near dying campfires and listened to the elders speak of her, the woman who made fire her voice, who turned masters into smoke. Every telling added a new detail. Some said she could vanish into mist. Others said her spirit lived inside every furnace that burned on a plantation. But through all the myths, one truth remained unshaken. She had done what no one thought possible. She had made the masters afraid, and that fear had become inheritance, passed from parent to child like a secret blade. The masters. New religion, the Rice Council, was gone, but its ideology remained. A new generation of planters rose to take their place, men who had heard the Greyfield story, whispered in the dark, and convinced themselves that cruelty was the cure for fear. They built churches that preached obedience, hung scriptures above the whipping posts, and told themselves that God had chosen them to rule. But sermons cannot silence history. Every time a master prayed aloud for divine order, his own voice trembled, because deep inside, every plantation owner knew that his wealth rested on the ashes of a circle of charred bodies, and the shadow of one woman who refused to kneel. The underground memory, in the decades that followed, slave communities learned how to hide intelligence in plain sight. Stories became code, songs became maps, myths became lessons in survival. A child's rhyme about the Lady of the Flame was actually a warning against overseers. A prayer about water that remembers fire described escape routes through the marshlands. Even the act of lighting the cooking fires at dusk became ritual, a symbolic reminder of Esperanza's furnace, the fire that burned injustice clean. No colonial law could reach this world. It lived in the language of rhythm and heartbeat. The changing wind by the 1750s, tension began to crack the colonies. The British Crown demanded more taxes. The merchants wanted more freedom. The landowners demanded more slaves. The talk of liberty had begun, but only for the white men who benefited from bondage. Yet even as they shouted for independence from Britain, they built their revolution on the same system Espiranza had already condemned, and still her legacy lingered. In Charleston, anonymous pamphlets began appearing, handwritten, unsigned, quoting words no one could source. Those who think themselves masters forget that coal burns from beneath. The governor dismissed them as the work of radicals. But among the slaves, those words spread faster than any sermon. They called it the coal prophecy. The hidden schools, in the shadows of the Low Country, an invisible revolution was taking shape. Runaway slaves, freed blacks, and sympathetic whites began gathering at night in the ruins of old plantations, teaching each other to read, to write, to plan. They called their gatherings the fireside circles. And at the center of every meeting, they lit a small, single coal in a bowl of iron. No flame, no smoke, just a glow. They said the coal represented Espiranza's spirit, slow, patient, unstoppable. Every meeting began with the same vow. Justice burns slower than coal, but it burns complete. What started as education soon turned to strategy. Escape routes became networks. Letters became blueprints. Faith became organization. The planters had built their empire on obedience. Espiranza had left behind the one thing they could never predict: thinking slaves. The archive opens. When the Charleston archives finally unsealed the governor's records in 1766, few expected what they would find. The dusty boxes contained official transcripts of the massacre, the sealed testimonies of witnesses, the notes from Johnson's secret council. And there, written in a clerk's clean hand, were Espiranza's final words: "Justice burns slower than coal, but it burns complete." For scholars, it was a revelation. For planters, it was a nightmare. Copies of the documents began to circulate in secret. Some were smuggled north to Boston and Philadelphia, where abolitionist thinkers began to see Espiranza not as a criminal, but as a revolutionary mind before her time. They called her the first fire of liberty. The Revolution's hidden hand when. The American Revolution erupted a decade later in 1775. The language of freedom filled every pamphlet, every speech. But somewhere beneath the slogans, the memory of Greyfield still lingered. Many of the earliest uprisings among Southern slaves coincided with the war. Masters went off to fight the British, leaving plantations underguarded. The enslaved seized their moment. Some fled to British lines, promised freedom in exchange for service. Others simply vanished into the swamps, guided by maps drawn in ash and memory. But a few stayed, lighting small, controlled fires in kitchens, barns, and fields, timed with uncanny precision. Not enough to destroy, just enough to remind. The fire wasn't vengeance anymore. It was a message. We remember. The master's last illusion: by the war's end, America declared itself free. But its soil was still soaked with the labor of the unfree. The plantation owners celebrated independence from the crown, while chaining others to their own dominion. They believed they had won, but in truth they had already begun to lose, because every field they plowed, every furnace they stoked, every child born into bondage carried the story of one night in 1716, a night when power turned to ash. Espiranza's ghost didn't need to haunt them. Their own memories did the work for her. The circle never breaks in 1788, 72 years after the Greyfield massacre. A traveling preacher in Charleston delivered a sermon that shocked even the white congregation. He spoke of a circle of justice and warned that those who burn others for profit will one day burn by their own fire. The preacher's name was Josiah de Lima. No one ever learned where he came from. Some said he was Espiranza's grandson. Others believed he was just another preacher who'd heard the old stories. But when he spoke, the people said his eyes shone like embers. That night, the church caught fire. No one was hurt, but when the ashes cooled, the pulpit was found untouched and carved into its wood. A single phrase: "The fire remembers." The dawn after Ashby, the turn of the century. The plantation still stood, but the cracks were visible. The songs of the enslaved carried new strength. The word freedom no longer belonged to white revolutionaries. It belonged to everyone who had felt the heat of injustice and refused to bow. And though her name never appeared in the textbooks, every whisper of rebellion, every fire that rose in the night, every chain that broke without explanation carried her legacy. Espiranza de Lima had become more than a woman. She was a phenomenon, a law of balance written in flame, because no matter how long injustice reigns, the coal beneath it still burns, waiting for air. And when that air comes, it does not whisper. It roars. Justice burns slower than coal, but it burns complete. Centuries passed, but Greyfield never vanished. The land was sold, divided, renamed. But every map of the Carolina marshes still carried an emptiness where it once stood, a hollow space where even the bravest surveyors refused to build. They said the soil there was cursed. They said nothing could grow. But those who knew the truth said something else entirely. It already grew fire. The forgotten furnace. By the 1800s, slavery had spread further south, to Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, a great, bleeding empire of cotton and chains. But even as the plantations multiplied, the ghosts of the old rice fields whispered. Espiranza's name had been twisted, translated and disguised. To some she was Azaria, the fire woman. To others, Mama Lima, protector of the oppressed. And in the spiritual songs sung under the stars, her story lived as a parable, not of vengeance, but of balance. Coal don't sleep, child, coal don't fade. Keep it deep, child, fire maid. They sang it to babies in cradles, to field hands before dawn, to fugitives running under the moon. Each verse was both memory and map. The age of iron, when the industrial age arrived, new furnaces rose, taller, hotter, hungrier than any Esperanza had ever seen. The same fire that once burned for freedom now forged chains of steel and engines of war. Factories filled the skies with smoke, but no one remembered the first furnace, the one that had burned for justice, not profit. Still, every now and then a worker in Charleston or Savannah would whisper the old story. They said when sparks jumped from the metal and danced on the floor, it was her spirit watching, reminding men who thought themselves gods that all fire eventually turns on its maker. Even in progress, the echo of Greyfield remained. The Civil War, then came the year 1861, when America turned its guns inward. The nation that had built its wealth on bondage finally tore itself apart over it. Armies marched, cannons roared, and fields once rich with crops now bloomed with blood. To the enslaved, the war was not about presidents or borders. It was about completion. They said the fire that Espiranza lit a century ago had finally found air. In letters written by Union soldiers, there are strange accounts. Abandoned plantations burning at night with no footprints found. A woman in white seen near the swamps before every slave escape. And men who swore they heard singing in languages they didn't know. The officers dismissed it as superstition. But to those who had carried her story in silence, it was confirmation. She had never left. The liberation. When freedom finally came in 1865, it arrived not as celebration, but as exhaustion. Men and women stood in empty fields staring at the horizon, unsure what freedom even meant after centuries of survival. But even in that silence, her spirit lived. Freed mothers told their children, "Don't thank the men who signed papers. Thank the woman who burned for you." And though no monument bore her name, her story was etched into everything that followed. In the hymns of the freed, in the sermons of black preachers, in the coded rhythm of the blues, every voice that demanded justice carried a spark of her defiance. The Reconstruction lies, the years after emancipation, were cruel in new ways. Freedom came with chains of another kind: poverty, laws, violence. The old master's sons put on uniforms and called themselves redeemers, vowing to restore the world their fathers had lost. But their nights were never peaceful, because whenever they rode through dark fields wearing white hoods, they said the air turned hot. Their torches would sputter, their horses would panic, and in the distance, faintly, someone would hum a song they couldn't trace, a melody carried from 1716. Coal don't sleep, child. The men called it superstition, but more than one never returned home. The fire in the north. By the turn of the 20th century, the world had changed again. Cities rose, trains thundered, machines replaced men. But in Harlem, Chicago, and New Orleans, a new kind of fire burned. In music, in art, in defiance. Writers began to rediscover the stories buried in the South's soil. One of them, a poet named Untold de Lima, published a pamphlet titled The Furnace of Memory. In it, he wrote, "My grandmother's grandmother told me of a woman who burned the masters and freed the souls of the living. She said fire is not destruction, it is remembrance made visible." The pamphlet was banned in the South, but spread underground through churches and jazz clubs. Every generation found her again under new names: Mother Flame, the Silent One, the Keeper of Coal. No history book mentioned her. But every movement for freedom borrowed her fire. The civil rights years in the 1950s and 60s, when marches filled the streets of America. The songs of protest carried a rhythm older than anyone realized. Hold on, we shall overcome, freedom is coming. All carried fragments of her lullaby, passed down through generations. In the Mississippi Delta, an old woman named Clara James was interviewed by a journalist. When asked why she joined the marches despite the danger, She smiled and said, "Because the fire remembers, baby. It always does." When pressed, she said her great-great-grandmother came from a plantation near Charleston. No one noticed that the name on the census beside hers was De Lima. The age of forgetting. As the modern world marched toward technology, people began to forget. The furnaces were replaced by electric lights, the fields by cities. The story of Espiranza faded again into whispers. But history has its own rhythm. Every time injustice rises, the air grows warm. Every time cruelty is called progress, the ground trembles. And somewhere, someone begins to hum. The return to Greyfield in 2016, exactly 300 years after the massacre. Archaeologists began excavations near the old plantation site in South Carolina. What they found shocked them. Buried beneath layers of earth, in what had once been the kitchen, they discovered a circular arrangement of melted iron shackles, fused together by extreme heat. In the center, fragments of burned coal. Still black, still cold. The lead archaeologist wrote in his journal, "It's as if the fire was too focused, too purposeful to be accidental." There's something unsettlingly deliberate here. When asked about the site name, he replied, "We've decided to call it the Furnace of Freedom." The voice of the flame later that year. During a summer storm, lightning struck the excavation site. The next morning, locals found the grass around the crater scorched in a perfect circle, just like the one described in the 1716 archives. A historian who visited that night swore she heard a faint sound, almost like a woman singing under the thunder. She couldn't make out the words, only the rhythm, a rhythm older than any nation, born of pain, patience, and fire, the endless echo. And so the story ends where it began, in fire. Espiranza de Lima was never meant to be a ghost or a saint. She was a mirror held up to cruelty, a lesson carved into flame. Her body vanished, her name faded, but her idea became eternal. That power built on pain will always, inevitably, meet its own heat, because history doesn't forget. It waits, it watches, it burns slow, and when the moment comes, it lights again in protests and revolutions, in every voice that dares to say no. So when you see fire in streets, in hearts, in change, remember the woman who first taught it to speak, Espiranza de Lima, the slave who taught the world that even silence can burn. Justice burns slower than coal, but it burns complete.